So we've examined the first two stages of memory, sensory memory and short-term or working memory, and so we're left with the last aspect of memory, long-term memory, and that's what we're going to start discussing today. And long-term memory, right, is this storage system that contains things that you aren't aware of, but you can recall and become aware of, right? So whenever you recall something, you actually move that information back into working memory. So long-term memory is defined as the system responsible for storing information for long periods of time. So in this cartoon, we have a situation where, Tony runs into Cindy on the street, and he first of all has to remember who Cindy is, right? So that's a long-term memory, that's recognition, and he brings the memory of Cindy back into conscious awareness, back into working memory. And along with his memory of Cindy, he also, remembers all of these different things about her, what type of movies she likes, for instance. A really interesting series of studies were run by Bennett Murdoch at the University of Toronto, comparing long-term memory to working memory or short-term memory within the same experiment. And these studies are known as serial position studies. The way this works is that a list of words are presented to participants. And after the last word, the participant writes down as many of the words as they can possibly remember. And when you do this, you see something kind of cool known as the serial position effect. And so your memory for this list of words will be enhanced for the initial words that you saw on the list and the final words that you saw on the list. This serial position effect was actually first noted by Ebbinghaus in the 1800s when he was examining his own memory of words. But what this effect gets at are sort of the interacting processes that make up short-term memory and long-term memory. But let's do an example of how a serial position study might work. So I'm going to have you immediately write down the following list of words after you see them, after they've disappeared from the screen. So as you're seeing the words, try to rehearse them, try to memorize them, try to keep them in mind and commit them to memory. Okay, here we go. Okay, so write down as many of the words as you can remember. And so the words were access, dinner, roof, dough, egg, mystery, chair, pen, jeans, and rebel. And so I suspect most people remembered the first and the last words. So access and rebel, and probably few people remembered egg and mystery, which actually occurred sort of in the middle of the list. And so this phenomenon is known as the serial position effect. And if we just plot the percentage of words recalled based on studies like this, we see what's called a serial position curve. And so what you can see in this curve, right, is that the words you first encounter, your memory for those words is actually pretty good. So you're up at like 60% accuracy. And the words you last encounter in that list, your memory is, again, quite good. You're up near 100% accuracy for the last word. And so we see two different effects here. We see what's called a primacy effect. So participants are more likely to remember words presented at the beginning of a list, and a recency effect. Participants are more likely to remember words presented at the end of a list. And lots of research has been done to sort of figure out, what's causing that primacy effect, what's causing that recency effect. And one thought, one idea, is that the primacy effect is partially due to your ability to actually commit some of these words to long-term memory. So the words you initially encounter at the start of the list, you have more time to rehearse those words. You have more time to encode them. And we can actually see that quite nicely in this study that was run in the 1970s. So this is repeating one of Murdoch's serial position experiments, except participants were given time to rehearse each word after they saw it. So imagine doing, the task that you just did, but after each word, there was like a 5-second break where you could rehearse the word over and over and over. So you see access, and you can rehearse it. Access, access, access. You see dinner, and then there's 5 seconds where you can rehearse access, dinner, access, dinner. You see roof, and then there's 5 seconds where you can rehearse access, dinner, roof, and so on and so forth. And so what do we see? It's no surprise that, the words that you're able to rehearse more, so words at the beginning of the list, you can rehearse them more, right, because they come early on, are remembered quite well. And the mean number of rehearsals, which is shown by this blue dashed line here, really, tracks your memory for words presented at the start of the list. So the suggestion here, right, is that rehearsal is driving that primacy effect. Basically, you're able to rehearse words that you see early on enough that you can sort of commit them to long-term storage. What about the recency effect? So what about the fact that, these words are remembered quite well, words at the end of the list are remembered quite well? Clearly you have very little time to rehearse these words, so they're probably not committed to long-term storage. One argument is that the recency effect reflects working memory. And in this 1966 study, they show that you can basically abolish that recency effect by just throwing in a delay after the words are presented. So a 30-second delay abolishes that recency effect. And so you can see that in this image here. You've got the red line, which shows a normal sort of serial position curve with the recency effect. So they read words, and then after they've done reading the list of words, they have to recall them. And we see that recency effect here. But if participants have to wait 30 seconds after the words are presented, we don't see that recency effect. So that's the blue dashed line here. And so the suggestion is that that recency effect is due to the words sort of bouncing around in working memory. And so if you throw in that delay, people just forget them. They leave working memory. And so you're left with just this primacy effect, just these words that have been committed to long-term storage. So what's interesting, right, about these serial position studies is that they sort of show long-term memory and working memory in one experimental paradigm. So another interesting aspect of memory is that we can code memory in different ways, right? So what do I mean by code? Well, when we talked about working memory in the last lecture, we talked about this phonological loop and this visual spatial sketchpad. And so what this suggests, right, is that we can play with memories, at least in our short-term store, based on how they look and based on how they sound. And we see the same thing with long-term memory, right? You can remember events visually. Think about Acadia's, beautiful campus, right? You can picture that right now. That's a visual long-term memory. Think about, the voice of a loved one, right? That's an auditory, phonological long-term memory. So it seems like, both means of coding, visual, based on the way things look, And coding based on how things sound, or based on phonology, it seems like these two coding schemes exist in both working memory and in long-term memory. There's another form of coding, though, that relates to what things mean, and this is known as semantic coding. And we see semantic coding in both short-term memory and long-term memory. And this is a nice example of semantic coding or semantic effects in short-term memory. So, simple experiment. On each trial, participants heard 3 words, and the words were related to categories that had different meanings, right? Fruits versus professions. So things that people do. These two categories mean very different things. The semantics of these two categories are quite different. And so on each trial, they heard 3 words drawn from one of these two categories. They counted backwards for 15 seconds, and then they recalled the words that they heard. And what's super interesting is that if you do successive trials and you draw words from the same category, you actually see this interference effect. So people sort of get worse at the task as trials go on. So on trial 1, right, you read people banana, peach, apple, wait 15 seconds, they say banana, peach, apple. You read to them plum, apricot, lime, wait 15 seconds, they say plum, apricot, lime. But you start to see errors as you go on. And as long as the words are drawn from the same category, you see these errors, you see this interference. They start to recall words that they previously heard on a previous trial. And you can see that in this figure here. So as we go from trial 1 to trial 2 to trial 3 to trial 4, the percentage of words recalled declines quite dramatically, right? We're up at like 85% to start, and we're down to, 20, 30% near trial 4. So quite a dramatic decline. And the explanation for this is that there's interference between the words because they all have the same meaning, or they all relate to fruits in some way, right? They're all drawn from the same semantic category. Now, what's interesting is that if you repeat this experiment, but on one of the trials you change the category, so on the last trial, instead of asking people to recall professions, which is what you did for trial 1, trial 2, and trial 3, if on the last trial you change the category and you have them recall fruits, you see that actually their memory of the words rebounds. And you can see that in this figure here. So in this case, they're having to recall professions: lawyer, firefighter, teacher, dancer, minister, executive, grocer, doctor, editor. Their performance declines because there's this interference, because all the words are drawn from the same category. And so people confuse, the words that they're hearing. But then when you draw words from a different category, their performance rebounds. And so what this suggests is that short-term memory relies to some extent on semantic coding, or remembering based on meaning. And we think this also applies to long-term memories. And, I'm not going to present a study that looks at this specifically, but, I'll just ask you to think about, a popular TV show or book that you've read at some point in your life, and you probably don't remember the specifics, right, of that book or of that show. You just sort of remember the gist of the show, the central storyline. So what you're taking away from, these interactions, reading, let's say, The Great Gatsby or watching Breaking Bad, is sort of the overall meaning of the experience. And so this would be an example of semantic coding in long-term memory. And we think that information is often encoded via its meaning in long-term memory. So let's talk about long-term memory in the brain, right? We talked a little bit about the brain basis of working memory in the last lecture. We discussed how, when you're keeping something in mind, when you're keeping something in working memory, we see activity in prefrontal cortex neurons. Long-term memory is a bit different because it seems to actually depend on a subcortical structure known as the hippocampus. And hopefully everybody remembers HM from intro psych, but HM, Henry Mollison, very famous neuropsychological patient. He had very severe epilepsy, and in the 1950s he had surgery to treat his epilepsy. And as part of the surgery, his medial temporal lobes on both sides of his head, so in the left and right hemisphere, were removed. So medial temporal, middle part of the temporal lobe, and this area happens to contain the hippocampus. And something unexpected happened. After HM recovered from the surgery, the doctors found that his memory for things that happened in the past was fine, was largely intact, but he was unable to form new long-term declarative memories. And we call this anterograde amnesia. So we often distinguish between retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. So in retrograde amnesia, this is the Jason Bourne type situation, right, where there's some sort of accident, you hit your head, and you can't remember things that happened in the past prior to the injury. Anybody who's ever had a concussion may have experienced retrograde amnesia, right? If you've badly hit your head and given yourself a concussion, you may actually forget the accident or not remember the accident. That's retrograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia, on the other hand, what HM had is a bit different. You have working memory, so you can still interact with people, talk to people, tell people about yourself, navigate around your world, but you can't commit any new information to long-term storage. So you can't transfer information from working memory into long-term memory. And, thinking about pop culture examples of anterograde amnesia, the best one is the Christopher Nolan film Memento. And the character has anterograde amnesia. He's trying to figure out who killed his wife, but of course he can't form any new memories. So he ends up, every time he learns a fact about the case, he tattoos it on his body. So very debilitating disorder. And the doctors who worked with HM, for years, HM never remembered them from session to session. So just thinking about HM's case, right, and you can see the brain damage in this MRI. So when you look at an MRI, black areas represent areas that are basically empty or filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And there are black areas in HM's medial temporal lobe where there should be neural tissue, right, whereas hippocampus was removed. And so it seems like the formation of new long-term declarative memories depends on this subcortical structure, depends on structures in the medial temporal lobe, in particular the hippocampus, and also to some extent the amygdala and the rhinal cortex. So HM's case of retrograde amnesia is the one that's typically taught in intro psych, and HM was, I think generally speaking, most people regarded him as a fairly pleasant individual. He had about 30 to 40 seconds of working memory so you could interact with him. But there are other more severe cases of anterograde amnesia. So one of those cases is an English musicologist known as Clive Waring. And he suffered a viral infection that totally destroyed his hippocampus bilaterally on both sides of his head. And unlike HM, Clive Waring only had 4 or 5 seconds of working memory. So very, very severe case of anterograde amnesia. Waring's wife, I believe, wrote a book about his case and how difficult it was. And I've got a quote here from her book. So it was as if every waking moment was the first waking moment. Clive was under the constant impression that he had just emerged from unconsciousness because he had no evidence in his own mind of ever being awake before. And so now she's quoting Clive, "I haven't heard anything, seen anything, touched anything, smelled anything," he would say. "It's like being dead." So very dramatic case of anterograde amnesia. This is a sample of Waring's diary. The doctors had him keep, and literally, as you can see, every minute he's saying, "I'm awake for the first time. I just woke up. I'm alive." Pretty shocking, right? 8:06, 9:06, now I'm awake. 9:34, now I'm awake, and so on. So a pretty dramatic case of anterograde amnesia. If you'd like to read more about Clive, in the slides I've linked to a New Yorker article that goes into the case in great detail. It's a very good article. And I've also included in the slides an 8-minute video of Clive. So what's interesting about Clive Waring was that his ability to play the piano was perfectly fine, perfectly spared. He was a musicologist, he was a good piano player, and he could play the piano without any problems. So we're seeing a distinction here between certain types of memories, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next lecture. So we've come to the lecture review. Question 1, bit of a tricky one. Remember an event from your childhood. As you think about that event, what memory system is the event in? So remember an event from your childhood. I'm thinking about riding. I used to have this thing called a big wheel. I don't know if anybody remembers big wheels. Kind of like a tricycle, except there was one ginormous wheel. I'm thinking about riding my G.I. Joe big wheel down the street. Where is that memory? As I think about it, it's in working memory, right? So I think I had this as one of my exam questions in intro psych. So when you think about something, a long-term memory, where is that memory stored? It's being stored in working memory, right? You're bringing it back to consciousness, and it needs to be restored. When you stop thinking about it, it needs to be restored. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's problematic, right? Because during that restorage, things can change, memories can change. So the answer here is it's working memory. When you stop thinking about an event, it moves back into long-term storage. What do serial position curves show? Question 2. What is the serial position effect? What do they show? So serial position curves provide some evidence that short-term memory and long-term memory are dissociable, right? So we have this recency effect and primacy effect. And so the idea here is that the recency effect reflects short-term memory or working memory. The words that you just saw are still sort of bouncing around in your consciousness. The primacy effect reflects more long-term memory processes. You've had enough time to rehearse those words, you can commit them to long-term memory. Question 3, what brain structure does the formation of new long-term memories seem to depend on? Hopefully everybody knows the answer to this one. What brain structure does the formation of new long-term memories seem to depend on? The medial temporal lobes, in particular the hippocampus and surrounding neural tissue. And we know that because of HM, because of Clive Waring and other patients who have severe anterograde amnesia because of damage to their hippocampus, to their medial temporal lobes. And we can also show in animals that damage to these structures results in deficits in the formation of new declarative type memories.